I want you to learn from this session some of the fundamentals about what overhead rates are and what they mean and what they don't mean. So I want you to be unimpressed by the time we finish this presentation. So what you know is this is we're still in the world of cost plus. This is our world. As Darren said, 91% of our compensation agreements are still cost plus. The search consultants have absolutely controlled this topic. They've absolutely figured out, and the cost consultants have absolutely figured out that this is their sweet spot. They can go to a client and say anything they want about overhead rates. And frankly, most of them, and I would suggest most of you, are absolutely unaware of what the overhead rate really means and what it really does. And I hope to change that perception a little bit this morning. We really incorrectly believe, because we've been told this to be a truth, that overhead rates are indicators of efficiency. They are not. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So our goal really as a starting point today, and then generally within the industry, is to start having a discussion about this and making sure that we all understand really what overhead rates are all about. But let me ask a question to those of you that are running operations or involved in the running of the operation. How many of you every month make decisions about hiring, about firing, about adding cost to your business, or taking cost away from your business because you know what your overhead rate is and what it's doing? So nobody uses the overhead rate to manage our business. But for some reason, it's become the tool that we allow people to use to manage our compensation. Doesn't that surprise you? So we need to fix that. So I have a couple of things that I want to declare as my view about overhead rates. And we're going to prove this. First of all, overhead rates are not efficiency metrics. And if you have a high overhead rate, that does not mean you're inefficient. And I hate to tell you, if you have a low overhead rate, that does not mean you're efficient. All right? And the other thing that we're going to show you a little bit later, I'm going to give you a little insight in terms of WPP's overhead rates for its 100-plus companies in the United States. There are no benchmarks for overhead rates, no matter what people try to tell you. So, but before we have this conversation in detail, I need to go through a little bit of history, very, very brief bit of history. So where did this thing come from? And there's a few of us, the ones that are getting a little bit older, were around when we were really shifting from a constant conversation about commissions to labor-based compensation. And the overhead rates were really driven by a simple need from the clients. And that is that the clients wanted to pay an amount to us that guaranteed us a fair profit, did not create a windfall, nor did it harm us. And at the time, the only tool that we could find as we were moving from commission rates was to look at our own internal cost accounting reports. And some genius said, oh, wait a minute, the agency has a cost accounting department. They're the most exciting group of people we have in our industry. And this cost accounting department has a number that they call an overhead rate. Let's use that, because that's a good way that we can predict the direct costs, we can figure out what that agency needs to mark up its costs to get the total cost recovery, and then we can agree a profit factor. But that history has been completely lost. And people have now said these are things that can be negotiated on. So with that in mind, we have to do a little bit of discussion about understanding the overhead rate. So what I want to do, and some of you have some handouts, and this is a complete duplicate of what I'm going to show you on the charts. I've laminated these because, frankly, I'd like you to take these away, and I'd like you to understand it, challenge it amongst yourselves. But let me just tell you, here's a start. Now, in order to have this start, we're going to have to do a little bit of math. Oh, there goes your stomach again, right? And so I'm going to paint for you a picture of a very, very simple agency. This agency has 3 employees. Simple. They've got a senior person, a junior person, and then some level of support staff. That's a very, very simple agency structure. Whether you're a small agency or big agency, you've got some level of support. And then every agency, assuming that they have some place to live, has all the normal expenses. And there's not an awful lot of magic to our expense base. We've got rent, utilities, we have to pay for IT, we have to pay for photocopiers still. You guys travel, we have new business expenses, and so on. This is all that it takes to do an overhead rate calculation. So for this first agency, I want to just fill in a couple of numbers. And you've got this in front of you as well on the first page. All right, so we have 3 people, and they earn numbers in the world of total labor, much to Darren's view of the world, which is we should be looking at total labor. Senior person earns $100,000 a year, junior at $75,000, and a support person at $25,000. That's fine, pretty simple mix. All of the other costs add up to $150,000. I've made it simple. The categories all look like $50,000 each. This could be any agency anywhere, and that's a relatively good example of what our mix of costs look like. So when we go to calculate the overhead rate, the first thing we do is we say, how much of our client-facing time is going to be in what we would call the direct cost bucket? And so in the simplest of worlds, we're going to do this example today where we say all of the senior person and all of the junior person are client-facing, and everything else becomes what we call the overhead of the company. And so the mathematics, you don't have to go to your finance director, you don't have to go to your clerks. This is essentially the background behind overhead calculations. And so what we do from there is we take these two columns, the last two columns that you're looking at here, and the formula is very simple. We have this final column that we call indirect costs, and we put it on top. And we have a column that we call direct costs, and we put that on the bottom. Lo and behold, when I take the numbers from this example, and you'll see in the second and third column, $175,000 or $175, whatever you want to call it, we get a very simple bit of math that says 1 over the other gives me my overhead rate. And so in this case, I've created a baseline agency that has an overhead rate of 100%. That's not an uncommon number. You guys are pretty comfortable with the concept of 100%. We have to keep in mind, though, because here's where the conversation starts getting confused. People assume that the overhead is a fixed number. What we do when we have these kind of compensation agreements is we've created a markup. And for those of you that have lived in the world of marking up your production, marking up your media, this is a markup. And so every time we add $1 of staff, we mark it up by, in this case, 100%. That's all the overhead rate is. It's just a markup. So really, one simple thing I need to explain to you is I've given you a very, very basic example of overhead rates. And in the real world, there is one simple change. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're in a 3-person agency, as I've drawn for you, whether you're in a 30-person agency, 300-person agency, or even bigger. This all follows the same basic rule. There's one fundamental difference when we do it for real, and that is the senior person and the junior person have some time that they spend outside of working on the client, whether that's training time, whether that's new business, pro bono, and so on, all the categories that Darren talked about. So I'm not going to do that today for this example, because that just adds one layer of complexity. I just need you to know that I'm making one slight assumption relative to the real world as we go through these examples. So let's move on. I want to show you 4 other agencies that look an awful lot like this first agency, and I want to show you how the overhead rates can be misinterpreted for those agencies. And these are all also in your handout. Now, we're going to look at 4 different agencies. They each are a 3-person shop, just like the one we created. They all live in a similar city. They all have similar footprint in terms of their space and so on. And we're going to compare these 4 new agencies back to the one that we just looked at. So here's the one we looked at. Very simple calculation. I've got a senior person at 100,000, junior person at 75, and so on. This is the one that we just created. Now, when I go through these 4 different agencies, here's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you that an agency with a lower overhead rate is actually more expensive. I'm also going to show you that an agency with a higher overhead rate is less expensive. I'm also going to show you how an agency that decides that they can be more efficient by deploying IT tools has a much higher overhead rate, but is cheaper than all the others. And then finally, I just want to talk about our world globally. I'm going to have a look at an agency that is outside the US, and we're going to choose India as an example, where we know there's cheaper staff. They have a much, much higher overhead rate, but they're cheaper than all the others. So the whole goal here is just to give you some sense of what these overhead rates are and are not. So let's walk through these examples very, very quickly. I've given you the handout so that we don't have to labor through the calculations, but I'm going to show you specifically what's changing in these 4 examples. So agency number 1 is our baseline. Agency number 2 will say pays its employees 10% more than the average. Now, does it mean that, oh, every person that walks in the door gets a paycheck that's 10% more? Maybe, but it also could be that their mix of staff, they have more senior people than the average, they have more junior people than the average, but the blend is different. But regardless, by the time that agency's finished, their payroll ends up being 10% higher than the base. So to make it easy on this second agency, I've just said, because I've only got 3 people, let's give them all salaries that are 10% higher. And so the person that used to be $100,000 a year is now 110. The person that was at 73 is now 83. 75 is now 83, and so on. And here's how the math works out. So if you track to the math, we have a difference here, which is now our direct client costs are higher, and our overhead is a little bit higher because we've got somebody here that's earning more. I've now got an agency who pays its people 10% more on average. Their overhead rate is 92% compared to the 100 we just did. Are they more efficient? Have they done anything to become more efficient than the first baseline agency? Absolutely not. They just happen to have a different model. But you'll have consultants who will tell you, there it is, I've got an agency that's 92%. They must manage themselves better. Absolutely not true. Third example. So let's go the other way. We just did an agency that has paying its people 10% more on average. Now let's take an agency that's paying its people 10% less on average. Pretty natural extension. So again, for the key people, my senior person no longer earns $100,000. They earn 90, the junior person's at 68, and so on. They're 10% less. So what's happened to the calculation? And you can follow this more at home. I bet you can't wait to show your kids tonight. My direct client time has gone down. My overhead is almost similar to what it was before. This agency now has an overhead rate of 109%. Oh my God, they must be more inefficient because they're not 100 like the baseline I created. But you know there's nothing that's happened in this agency that's made them more efficient than the baseline or the first agency. So that's example number 3. Sorry, these are the numbers that changed. So agency 4, now here's where the world gets interesting. How many times have you been in a discussion with a client and the client has said, if you just became more efficient, your overhead rate would go down? In fact, we have, and I know some of you in the room, I've done it early on, we've agreed with clients that we would find a way that the overhead rate would go down year after year over, say, a 3-year period. We'd start at 100, we'd go down to 98, we'd go down to 95 because we all think lower overhead rates are good. Right? We've got that wrong. So let me just tell you what happens. So this agency has decided to invest in some tools. They'll spend some money on that. And by doing that, they find a way to take their junior person, remember it's a pretty simple agency, and rather than having, say, an account supervisor level, they said, I can get away with an account executive because I have some tools that will help me run this business. So here's what happens in this example. The only change here is that my junior person is no longer paid $75,000 a year, they paid $50,000, and down in the IT area, I added $10,000 in additional costs. Now, we would say from a business standpoint, I've reduced salaries or staff costs by 25, and I've increased my IT costs by 10. That's a net decrease of 15. I'm pretty smart, right? That sounds like a good deal. But what happens to the overhead rate? Well, I have fewer people to build a client. Or I should say I have a lower cost of people to build a client. And what happens? My overhead rate is now 123% versus the baseline we looked at 100. So the concept that is in the minds of our clients and procurement, which is if we invest in tools, our overhead rate goes down, absolutely false. And that just doesn't, that's one of the things that we have to demystify. So one final example, and then we're going to summarize this. Let's take Mumbai. If you were to rent a building in Mumbai, you'd be paying about $90 a square foot today. If you rent a building in New York City, you'd be paying about $70 a square foot today. Mumbai is more expensive per square foot. True, they're probably going to squeeze a few more people in. But it is, they do. So what happens to that? We know that the salaries of places like India are a lot less than salaries in New York City. And just to show that example, let's just assume for the same layout that these people earn on average about 30% of the value that we might have in a Western market. So what happens to their overhead rate? Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind is the rent is higher. Actually, when they have to go and get computers, well, they're going to probably pay the same price that we pay here. In fact, the United States is known to still be cheaper in terms of acquisition of IT and hardware costs than many other markets around the world. Cell phones, they're no cheaper in India than they are here. Telephone systems, photocopiers, computers are no cheaper. In fact, in some cases, they're more expensive. There are no other deals to be had in this global marketplace when we're looking at setting up an office. So what's happened to their overhead rate? If you look over in the left-hand, sorry, the right-hand column, Mumbai has an overhead rate of 267%. God, they must be inefficient. Not true. And they must be expensive if that's the case. Also not true. So let's just summarize this in terms of what each of these agencies look like when you evaluate them relative to the total fee charged to the client. And if we were to pick a number like 1,800 hours a year as the standard hours that are used, we can actually come up with an hourly rate. And I don't want to have the debate about whether it's 1,800 hours or 1,550. That's another presentation. But here's our baseline agency. Ultimately, this baseline agency would work out with this staff of having a billable rate of $122 an hour. Okay, that's fine. Now, our agency that had a 10% increase in staff, but they had a lower overhead rate, they're at 92%. They're clearly more efficient. But wait a minute, the client's going to pay me $129 an hour. So I got a client that thinks they've got a better agency because the overhead rate's actually lower, but the client's going to pay a higher fee. If you then move to the agency that has the lower salaries, they have a higher overhead rate, as we showed. They've actually now got a billing rate of $115 an hour. And then our productivity team, boy, remember we did the productivity investment? Our overhead rate shot up to 123%. What happened to their billable rate? It did what you thought it should do. It went down. In fact, it went down below the baseline. The billable rate ends up being $116 an hour. The concept of productivity tools, investing in tools and reducing your number of staff or reducing your seniority staff absolutely works. It just doesn't work from the standpoint of overhead rates. And then finally, Mumbai, not surprising, we always think of these markets as being less expensive. They have an extremely high overhead rate. Their billable rate to a client is about $76 an hour. So from that, we end up with a picture that says, so what can you tell from an overhead rate? Very simply put, I would say absolutely nothing. An overhead rate is a little bit like your blood type. Do we really care what blood type you are? It just so happens to be how you're structured. It just happens to be what you have to do in your agency to take your staff and mark it up to get full cost recovery. And whether you have a high overhead rate or a low overhead rate, it's really just about your own DNA. I want to show you a couple of other quick things. I promised you a look at WPP's overhead rates across the US. So here's a really exciting chart. This is just a very simple plot of every one of our offices in the United States and where their overhead lands. Now, there's a couple of assumptions we've got to make. First of all, we're expressing this as a percentage of direct salaries. It just so happened to be the data we had. We've taken out all of our offices that are under $1 million. Okay, who cares? And then we've said every one of these offices will have some sort of ratio on their payroll where 75% of their payroll works for clients. So that's the only standardization we did. And if you look way up at the top, I've got a company that has an overhead rate pushing 250%. They're by no means the most expensive agency in our network. I also have an agency down in the bottom left quadrant that's just over 70%. Do you know that that agency, and I won't tell you who they are, is actually our most expensive agency? And the reason that they're most expensive is they are a highly strategic group of people. They don't pay anybody in their organization less than about $200,000 a year. But guess what? They have similar space that you have and I have per person. So when we look at this, you know, we're dealing with a lot of data points. We've got a scattergram that says it could be anywhere. Maybe if you're really clever, you could figure out some trend analysis from this. You can't. And one of the things that we're trying to do in our organization is start talking about how we may have data points, but there is no such thing as benchmarks. So for a client that shows up and says, we have benchmarks, I really want you to be unimpressed, because they don't. Now, when we look at this business, and we look at our business across the US or across the world, we have all the data. You guys that are working for agency networks, you have all the data. Like me, I'm sure you've had no ability to create benchmarks. There are too many variables in how we structure ourselves, the kind of teams that we put in place. And so when we try to benchmark ourselves, and frankly, I should have more data than just about everybody, I can't benchmark it. So it's a complete farce, but we allow ourselves to get dragged into that farce. A couple of other quick things that are worth mentioning because it comes up time and time again. First of all, this banana stuff that comes out of consultants, which is you, the agency, must be hiding profit in your overhead. All right? You can't hide. If your overhead is based on an expense-driven ledger, that's all that's in there as expenses. and it's rubbish. And if you have somebody telling you that, you can just flat out call them a liar. It's just bananas. It's a way that consultants get a rise out of the clients, and the clients start to believe it. Here's the other big thing. We looked at that video this morning where the people in the restaurant wanted to know what the taco bar would have cost. We continue to have clients that award us the business. They have a cost base from the taco bar equivalent of our industry, and they think that they should be able to buy all of our services but pay us based on the structure of the one-man band or the low-cost agency that's got a couple of people to get the work done. Don't let agencies do that. Don't let clients do that to you. They have hired you, and so they should pay you for your blood type, your overhead rate. Don't let yourself get bamboozled into those kind of discussions. I mentioned this earlier. Agreeing to any kind of a multi-year declining overhead rate deal is ridiculous. It makes no sense. And if you do, what's the best way to watch your overhead rate go down? The best way to watch your overhead rate go down is to pay your people, increase the salaries of the people quicker than you increase the costs of your overheads, such as your office costs, rent, and so on. That is really what happens. So if you've been lucky enough to see an overhead rate decline, chances are that you actually managed to give increases to your staff at a rate greater than what you paid for your overheads. It's ridiculous. It didn't save the client a cent, even though they think they're happy. The other thing we get into, I started off this conversation by saying the overhead rate is a markup. It's not an actual cost. It's a markup on the direct staff that you've sold into the client. We get clients that show up and say, I just want to pay the incremental overhead. Well, actually, sorry, we've calculated this on the basis of a bucket of costs, and we've marked it up. I don't have any particular identifiable overhead increases. And so again, shoot that down and just push back. So the question then becomes, we've had a great conversation with our client and tell them how ridiculous their discussion of overhead rates are. They're going to be left saying, well, now what do I do? Okay, it's not hard. When you go shopping, what do you look at? If you're comparing two items, you ultimately look at the total cost. I'm either going to pay $100 for this shirt or $120 for this shirt. Do I think it's worth it? You don't look at, okay, what was the labor that was put in there? Did it come from Malaysia? Did it come, we look at total costs, and so should our clients. So in terms of, how you benchmark, because this is really the challenge that our clients want, it's about your total fee relative to service. You could look at total fee per person. That tells you a little bit about the mix of seniority. You could look at your blended hourly billing rate. That does tell you a little bit about the mix, assuming that you can align your scope to be similar. You can look at your billing rate by function. That's actually something that can be benchmarked. Whether it means anything is a different matter. And you can also look at your average salary per head of the team. That's not unlike your total fee per person. It is something that starts telling you about the mix of people that are there. But the overheads do absolutely nothing. So, as I finish up this conversation, what I would suggest you do, it's entirely possible, in fact, it's most likely, that some of you are listening to this going, I don't think this guy knows what he's talking about because this is not how I've been trained. Okay? So go away and spend some time, look at this, which is why I did this as a handout. So don't be surprised if you're struggling. Review the information at your own pace, go through it again, call me. I'd be happy to just continue to push this point. I would really encourage you to take this presentation. It is yours to have. Rebrand it. Take that silly logo at the bottom off. Give it to your own management. Discuss it, debate it, and make sure you understand it. And then, frankly, you should give the same presentation to anybody that comes ever close to a conversation about compensation. I don't care whether you start at the receptionist, but start somewhere and go all the way from the bottom to the top so that people are aware of what overhead rates are. Okay? I would really encourage you to share this presentation with your clients. Make it your own, customize it, but start to educate them. Throw them off, right? Because they've decided there's some truth in this. Just in the same way that you have to reevaluate your beliefs, you're going to have to do the same thing with your clients. And then, finally, challenge those people that would tell you that they have benchmarks. Challenge those people that would tell you that the overhead rate matters, all right? And by challenging them, I just want, when they call you and tell you we have benchmarks, I just want you to be unimpressed. Thank you. Actually, we've now had, I would say, 3 really detailed discussions with our biggest clients. Yeah. One of them started the conversation by saying, next week we're going to start the discussion of negotiating your overhead rate. And we said, fine. But before we have that conversation, we'd like to supply you with some material. And what we gave them was a number of the 4A's documents. There is some great information that has been published really about this topic going back 10 years. We've just never really read it and absorbed it. We've kind of ignored it because we've allowed the client's agenda and the consultant's agenda to push us. So I would say very successful. And in fact, in one major client, the entire process just disappeared because we presented this deck or something like this to them, and they all kind of went, so we got to go back and think about this some more. There are other clients who have been so driven by overhead rates that we presented this to them, and we've been in discussions when they've said, oh yeah, but we want to benchmark your overhead rate, and I've had the ability now to say, remember that presentation? They went, oh yeah. They don't quite know what to do other than they know this makes sense. It is the most common thing that they say, which is, you're expensive. You're the most expensive. I mean, you can pull it from their playbook. During a pitch, if you don't bring your cost down by 25%, we can't take you to the next round. BS. If you don't, we've now had submissions. You're 15% higher than everybody else. If you don't get down there, we can't carry on. You have to just let that stuff fly by. You have to put the filter on of what do these people do. I think this morning Andrew said it perfectly, which is this is their job. And that's their playbook. And the more that you understand their playbook, the more at ease you will be when they essentially hold something to your face and say, you're ugly, you need to fix this. You just become comfortable with the fact that that's going to happen.